So you got into coyotes by studying wolves first?
Well, yeah, it's kind of weird because wolves were the target, right? I was working on volunteering on the wolf project, and then it's kind of I call coyotes my accidental species because no matter what I did, every time I was working on another species, coyote kept popping up. And eventually, after about 15 years of that, I was like, maybe I should be studying coyotes because nobody else is really focusing on them in Canada. And so. Yeah, I had worked in Nova Scotia very early on as a volunteer, working with captive wolves. And of course, then again, that's what I did. I went there to work with the captive wolves. And what do you know, I had 3 little coyote puppies to take care of and to study the development of play in coyotes. And at the time, I don't think I didn't realize the significance of it as much. But play is really foundational in terms of understanding communication in animals. Most mammals play to some degree, but play actually is the development of language, and same with humans, right? So they learn the rules of how to get along, and if you don't play by the rules, of course, you get punished. And so with play in coyotes, it's they're with dogs, they have bite inhibition, and so they don't bite too hard. You can be a dominant animal, subdominant animal. You can be a big or small, but when you play, it's a great equalizer. But when you break the rules, like you bite too hard, or you bite in the wrong place, or you mount, your play partner, the game will stop. And so they learn that if they don't inhibit their bite. This is the same thing with dogs, right? If they learn they don't inhibit their bite at the right time, then the fun stops and the endorphins stop, right? And it's the same with kids. So they're learning in those play scenarios how to socialize. And what it does tell us about animals like coyotes or other social animals is that they do have a moral code of conduct. They know the difference. They have to control how they interact with other animals in order to get along well. And when you have social animals, like, let's say, coyotes can live alone or they can live in packs. And they are a little lower social order than something like wolves. Wolves must, pretty much must live in a pack to survive because the body size requires them to take down large prey, and the large prey in order to survive, and the large prey that they need to take requires more than one individual. And so to be a wolf, you have to be more forgiving of other people's, other members' transgressions, or control yourself, right? So you have to be more social. Coyotes can live in a much more flexible way, and as such, they have evolved to be a little less social. There's a little more aggression between individuals within, but they still have to. They're still very tightly bonded. They love each other, and they still have to get along when they live in packs, right? And so play is really the precursor to that, where they learn the rules of right and wrong. And that's where we now get into this idea of if animals play and have these codes of conduct, then they have a moral, they have a morality similar to ours. And therefore, in an animal rights perspective, people would look at that and say, well, then therefore they should have moral considerability. Perhaps not the same as humans, but they should have some form of a higher level of moral considerability.
Other than like what Descartes thought, where they were just machines.
Yeah.
Or B.F. Skinner, or they weren't conscious, and all
they're
this philosophic nonsense.
Response.
Yeah, some people.
Stimulus response.
It goes back, and some people say, Stoics might have said this. I got to look into it. I'm not sure their position, but even way back in the Stoics in ancient Greece, I think some people thought that animals weren't really conscious. And then I don't know if it was then or later in philosophy, but then some of this screwy idea that if you're in pain, it's not real, but it's when you are aware that you're in pain. It's real. It's like, that is ludicrous.
Yeah, it goes back to it's really disturbing time period in human history. But in terms of Descartes, I think therefore I am. But didn't apply to animals. It only applied to humans. But then later we started with vivisections, right? Which was based on the same idea. They felt that when they were cutting, vivisection is live cutting, when they would experiment on animals, and in the medical realm, right, instead of cutting open people, they would just attribute the noises to simply sounds, not feeling. And so, but you know what? That's not gone. There's a lot of people that still think that way.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So we're still overcoming that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then that's one thing that led to some, like, what amounts to physical abuse of, like, young children, too. They're 2 or 3. They don't know it yet. Like, they're not reflective, so they don't really feel it. So they'll forget.
Right.
It doesn't really exist. But, yeah, it's pretty sad. But, so deer can play, too. Coyotes, wolves, deer. A lot of animals have play and teaching as well. It's interesting.
So do all of our domestic animals, and all the ones that we eat also play, right? So it's when you start digging into that, it does change the way you think of it, and you have to come to terms with those kinds of questions. That's the kind of stuff I tackle in my animal geography class, is about these. How do we make the decisions we do about which animals we will eat or not? And so, yeah, it is more and more we're recognizing consciousness in so many animals. And it's fantastic, because the bar is starting to move on that. And yeah.
What are some books you know of, maybe articles or books for the general layperson that might be interesting in that regard about animal consciousness?
One of the most influential for me was work by, and it's extremely accessible, Mark Bekoff's work on Emotional Lives of Animals is one of the names of the books. He has many, the Animal Manifesto and that, and those are really nice reads. There's also a little bit more, if you get back into Frans de Waal's work on animals. It does go way back to Darwin has a book called Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, which essentially outlines the fact that we have all the same emotional expressions, or just in terms of consciousness we're all on a spectrum. But I would say, for contemporary stuff that's very accessible and yet still, full of scientific background, would be Mark Bekoff's book. And of course, he's also with Project Coyote advisory board, so you can find him that way too. But it'd be easy to just Google those. And that's actually one of the textbooks I used in my class is his book, Emotional Lives of Animals, because it outlines a lot of those foundations for understanding sentience in animals, and lots of examples of different animals and how they express sentience.
Cool. And I'll put some links to some of their books in the show notes for folks, and
Sure.
Then some others I've read, I'm aware of, like I think Carl Safina, if I remember right, he's written some stuff. And this guy, biologist, naturalist, Baron Heinrich, he's done some really good work on
the raven stuff.
yeah.
Very much so. The raven stuff is, gosh, I read that a long time ago, and I loved that his first book on the ravens. Oh yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. He's got a lot of books.
Yeah, thinking about tool use and in animals that we wouldn't traditionally think, and we're learning more and more about things like raven families pairing with wolf families, and we see a lot of this sort of mutualism that. So, for example, coyotes, you often see magpies nearby with them. And I think one of the really interesting things that I find about this is I started reading a lot of the First Nations storyline, and a lot of these relationships are described within those stories about, if you're looking at the coyote stories, for example, what is coyote doing and who is he closely engaged with most of the time. And those things that we now are knowing are mutualist behaviors in science. We're proving it with science. We're actually embedded in stories a long time ago, and I love seeing that we've missed that for so so many hundreds of years we've missed it.
Yeah.
That indigenous knowledge is already telling us all of these things. So
yeah, I hear other stories on a similar vein like that about scientists going somewhere and trying to investigate something, and some of the locals have already known it. It's already in their lore and wisdom, and or else they tell the scientists, the local folk tell the scientists something, and they don't believe it, but then eventually they investigate it and find out it was right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. But and then Dan Flores is a book, Coyote America. Again.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's a great his recent book, Coyote America, fantastic. So yeah, there's lots out there. I didn't have all those stored in my brain. You're right. You're hitting all the key ones there.
Cool. So you were studying wolves, and you started out getting into coyotes by watching them play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah. And then I came back and I did my master's and my PhD on sort of not on coyote stuff, but coyote kept popping up in all of the work that I did. And then it was really in 2005, I think, that I formalized that. And I had a student who had come in who was interested in working on that. And so we started a project that was really an ecological study about what do coyotes eat and where in urban settings. And is that connected to where they get into more conflict? So the idea there being we know that animals can habituate to human food. And so if we wanted to understand if there was a connection between where they were eating human food and the chances, the encounters that people were having or pets being killed or that. So that was really the first of its kind in Canada, where we were looking at the diet and then also comparing that spatially across the city, where the diet was, if it had more garbage, was there more conflict? And really, there hadn't been an urban coyote diet study done at the time either. So I had a student who came in, and she was just stellar, Victoria, and did the scat collection and analysis. And at the same time, I was working on conflict work from reports on coyotes. So we dovetailed those together. We saw some really cool stuff with respect to the diet. We saw, they're eating the things that they shouldn't be eating, but people were leaving out, uncontrolled garbage and bird seed and dog food. But also there were periods of time where they were eating crab apples. And so they were cleaning up a lot of the fruit, crab apples and other berries from the trees, and the other one being Saskatoon berries, which is a little blue, like a blueberry on a tree that we have here. It's native here. And so those types of things, and some of those, the crab apples, are a fruit-bearing tree that has flowers on it, and people like to plant it in urban areas because it's really pretty in the spring. But what we're finding then is that animals are coming in and eating that, animals that we don't necessarily want to be spending a lot of time around people. And the more time they're doing that, the more likely they're going to get into conflict. They get dependent on that food, and they get protective of that food. And so the crabapple one was pretty cool, and that was just during the fall, mostly after they'd fallen off the trees. But so it was kind of, this is one of those things that coyote do to you that keep you wanting to study coyote. We wrote up a little report for the city about management recommendations, and we suggested that obviously coyotes are cleaning these things up off the ground, and so people should make sure they clean up all the fruit off the ground. And then I also had an online reporting site, a mapping tool that citizens could report coyote sightings to. Through that, they ended up having a lot of public engagement. And people, one day, all of a sudden, somebody sent me a note and said, I think you should take a look at this. And it was a citizen in Calgary had filmed a coyote in their crabapple tree about 15 feet up. It climbed up into the tree, and it was winter, and it was picking the crab apples. It was balanced like a little ballerina. It was balanced like a little ballerina up in the trees and picking the crab apples.
Wow.
And so again, totally, just when we think we figured out using normal tracking and normal scientific methods, that was another example, though, where the eyes of the citizens and the people, the locals on the land, can fill you in on bits and pieces that you might not know are happening. And so that was a valuable shift there. But what it did mean that people actually have to pick the fruit, right? Not just pick up off the ground. And so that was a bit eye-opening.
Yeah. Instead of planting